A scarred mountain man walked into a saloon in the dead of winter and said he needed a wife. Not someday. Tonight. The whole room laughed. They stopped laughing when he told them why. 2 orphaned children were alone in a cabin high in the Wyoming mountains. And if he walked into that courtroom without a wife beside him, those kids would be loaded onto a train and disappear forever. Every woman in that room looked away. Every woman. Except one. If you want to know what happened next, stay with me. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The cold that settled over Black Hollow in the winter of 1874 was not the kind of cold that simply made a man uncomfortable. It was the kind that killed quietly, that crept under doors, reached through wool blankets, and found the weak ones first. The kind that turned a bad situation deadly and a desperate situation impossible. It was that kind of cold, bone-deep, merciless patient. On the night Gideon Crow walked into the Broken Spur Saloon and changed everything. He came in through the front door without knocking it open dramatically. No theatrical entrance. He just pushed through and the door banged against the wall from the force of the Wyoming wind behind him. And every man inside turned at the sound. They saw him, and most of them wished they hadn't. Gideon Crow was not a man you wanted to see walking toward you. He stood over 6 feet in his trapper boots, shoulders broad enough that he had to turn sideways through some doorways. His coat was elk hide, dark with grease and old weather, and it carried the smell of wood smoke, pine resin, and something wilder that no one could quite name. A scar ran from his left jawline down into the collar of his shirt. An old scar, silver white and thick, the kind that didn't come from an accident. His hands were the size of supper plates, cracked along every knuckle, stained with the work of the wilderness in ways that no amount of scrubbing would fix. He was 34 years old, and he looked 50. His eyes swept the room the way a hunter's eyes sweep a tree line, measuring, calculating, looking for threat. They were a pale, washed-out gray that caught the lamplight wrong, giving them an unsettling quality that most men found easier to avoid than hold. 2 cowboys at the nearest table shifted in their seats and made a point of studying their cards. The piano in the corner went quiet. Gideon walked to the bar. He didn't remove his hat. He put both hands flat on the counter and looked at Earl Dugan, the bartender, a barrel-chested man with a mustache like a small animal perched above his lip. "I need a wife," Gideon said. Earl Dugan blinked. "Beg your pardon?" "A wife." Gideon's voice was low and rough from months of talking to no one. "Tonight, before sunrise." The silence stretched for exactly 2 seconds before the laughter started. It began at the card table, a sharp bark from a cowboy named Pete Halford who'd had 3 whiskeys and very little sense even when he was sober. It spread from there the way fire spreads through dry brush, table to table, man to man, until the whole saloon was alive with it. Someone at the back said something that made the men nearest him roar. Earl Dugan had the decency to press his lips together, but his mustache twitched with the effort of suppressing his smile. Gideon stood still through all of it. He didn't flush. He didn't tighten his jaw or reach for his belt. He just waited, the way a man waits for weather to pass, and eventually the laughter wound itself down, and the room went quiet again, and he was still there. "You done?" he said. Pete Halford grinned. "Crow, you're the ugliest man in 3 territories. What woman in her right mind would—" "The Alderton children," Gideon said. The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. It silenced Pete Halford mid-sentence. It silenced the murmuring that had already started back up. Even Earl Dugan stopped reaching for the glass he'd been about to polish. Everyone in Black Hollow knew the Alderton name. Everyone knew the story. The wagon accident on the mountain pass in October, the parents killed instantly. The 2 young children found alone in the wreckage by a hunting party. They knew because it had passed through town like a fever, whispered from porch to porch and counter to counter, one of those tragedies that makes people hold their own children a little tighter at night. And most of them knew, though few had spoken it aloud, what had happened to the children afterward. "What about them?" Earl Dugan said carefully. Gideon looked at the room rather than at any one man. His voice didn't rise. He wasn't performing. He spoke like a man reporting facts, flat and direct and leaving no room for interpretation. "They're in my cabin, up on the ridge. They've been there since October, since I found them the night their folks died. I kept them alive through the first snowfall.
I kept them fed. He paused. I'm not a guardian. I'm not a family man. I don't know the first damn thing about children, but there's a territorial judge coming through Black Hollow in 4 days, and someone filed a petition to put those children on an orphan train east, and if I walk into that courtroom without a wife beside me, the judge is going to look at me and see exactly what you all see. A mountain man with no home fit for children. And he's going to sign the paperwork, and those kids are going to be shipped off to somewhere none of us will ever know.
The room was so quiet that the wind against the walls was the loudest sound in it. So, Gideon said, I need a wife. Tonight. Reverend Blount is willing to perform the ceremony before dawn if we go to him now. He looked around the room. His jaw was set. I'm not asking for love. I'm not asking for forever if that's not what a woman wants. I'm asking for someone willing to stand beside me in that courtroom and help those 2 children keep a home. He stopped talking. He waited. Nobody volunteered. Not the saloon girl in the corner who'd been watching him with wide eyes. Not the young widow of the blacksmith's brother who sat near the window nursing a cup of tea she'd come to get away from her empty house. Not a single person in the room moved. Pete Halford broke the silence again, though the meanness had gone out of him somewhat. Crow, it's not that anyone doesn't feel for those young ones, but you're asking a woman to walk into the mountains in winter and live in your cabin, and with all respect, he gestured vaguely at Gideon's general person, the scarred face, and the elk-hide coat, and the look of a man who'd spent the better part of a decade alone. You're not exactly a comfortable prospect. Gideon said nothing. There was nothing to say. The man wasn't wrong. The silence stretched, and then, from the far end of the room, from a corner so deep in shadow that most people hadn't even noticed anyone sitting there, came the sound of a chair scraping back against the floorboards. Evelyn Mercer had been sitting in that corner for 2 hours. She came to the Broken Spur sometimes on cold evenings, not to drink, not to socialize, but simply because the alternative was her own small room above the laundry and the particular quality of silence that existed there. The silence of a woman who had eaten dinner alone for 4 years. The silence of empty chairs and unwashed second cups, and a child's coat still hanging on the hook by the door that she could not bring herself to take down. She was 31 years old. She did not look it in the way that grief tends to age some people and hollow out others. Evelyn had been hollowed. She was thin in a way that suggested forgetting to eat more than any conscious choice. Her hair was dark, pulled back practically at the nape of her neck. Her face was the kind of face that people had probably called pretty once, and now mostly looked past, the way people look past furniture that has always been there. She had been a fixture of Black Hollow's background for so long that even Earl Duggan sometimes forgot she was in the room, which was, in a way, why she had heard everything so clearly. Nobody performed for Evelyn Mercer. Nobody softened the story for her benefit. She had simply sat in her corner and listened, and what she had heard, the flat, exhausted honesty of a man describing 2 children alone on a mountain, had done something to the quiet, careful structure she had built around herself over 4 years of surviving. It cracked it, just slightly. Just enough. She stood up. Every head in the room turned toward her. She felt their eyes and kept her chin level and walked toward the bar, and she was aware of how she must look. This small, pale woman in her plain wool dress moving across the room toward the largest, most frightening man in it. And she did not let herself think too hard about what she was doing, because if she thought too hard about it, she would sit back down. She stopped a few feet from Gideon Crow. Up close, he was worse than he'd seemed from across the room. The scar was deeper than she'd thought. He was looking at her with those pale gray eyes, and she couldn't read a single thing in them, which was unsettling. "How old?" she said. He frowned slightly. "What?" "The children. How old are they?" A pause. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like he was recalibrating. "Lucas is 8. Maisie is 5. Evelyn nodded slowly. She did the math without meaning to. Maisie would have been a baby when Evelyn's own son died. Her throat tightened and she pressed the feeling back down where it belonged. "What are they like?" she asked. The frown deepened. She could tell he hadn't expected questions. He'd expected either a flat refusal or some dramatic scene, and instead he was being interviewed. "Lucas is angry," he said finally. "He's been angry since I found him. Maisie is—" He stopped. He looked at the bar for a moment, and something in his face changed in a way that was hard to name. "She's very small," he said. "She cried every night for the first month. She doesn't much anymore. I don't know if that's better." Evelyn understood, in the way that only people who have been very close to grief understand, exactly what he meant by that. The crying is terrible, but the silence afterward is something else entirely. "What's your cabin like?" she said. "2 rooms, fireplace in the main room, sleeps 4. It's tight, but it's solid. I built it myself. It doesn't leak." He paused. "It's high up. The trail can close for days in a bad storm." "And what do you want from me exactly, in practical terms?" He looked at her as though he wasn't sure whether to be relieved or suspicious that she was still talking. "Stand beside me in the courtroom. Be there so the judge sees a family, not just me." He held her gaze. "After that, whatever arrangement you want. I won't make demands on you. You can go back to town once the custody's settled, if that's what you want." "And if I stay?" "Then you stay." He said it simply, without promise or performance. "I won't make it harder for you than it already is." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of the entire room holding its breath around her. She was aware that every person in that saloon thought she was making a terrible mistake. She was aware, dimly, that they might be right. She thought about Maisie, 5 years old, crying herself to sleep every night in a mountain cabin with a man who didn't know how to comfort her. She thought about her son's coat on the hook by her door. "All right," she said. The room erupted. Not in applause, in the loud, disbelieving noise of people who can't quite believe what they just witnessed. Earl Dugan said, "Evelyn, for the love of—" And Pete Halford actually stood up. 2 women who'd been watching from the doorway to the back room started talking over each other. Gideon Crow looked at Evelyn Mercer for 3 full seconds without speaking. Then he said quietly, so only she could hear, "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said. "Then why are you?" She looked at him. "Because nobody else is." He didn't have a response to that. He nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and turned toward the door. "We should go find Reverend Blount now, if we're doing this." Evelyn picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She was shaking slightly. She could feel it in her hands, and she was glad the coat hit it. She followed Gideon Crow out of the Broken Spur Saloon while the noise of 20 stunned people rose behind them and the Wyoming wind hit her in the face like a cold, open hand. Reverend Marcus Blount was 62 years old and had, in his 2 decades of frontier ministry, married people under conditions that the denominations back east would have found irregular. He had married a couple in a barn during a flooding. He had married a dying man to his sweetheart on a Tuesday morning while the doctor waited in the next room. He had learned, in short, to ask fewer questions than most clergy and to find the sacred in places that didn't look sacred at first glance. Still, he stood in his doorway at 11:30 on a November night in 1874, holding a lamp and looking at Gideon Crow, and a woman he vaguely recognized from Sunday services, and he said, "Tonight, before sunrise," Gideon said. The Reverend looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Mercer, you understand what you're agreeing to?" "Yes, Reverend." "You're certain?" She met his eyes. "Please, Reverend." He stepped back from the door and let them in. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Evelyn had been married before, in a white dress in a proper church with flowers and 100 guests. And that ceremony had taken the better part of an afternoon. This one took 11 minutes in Reverend Blount's parlor, by lamplight, with his wife Agnes as witness. Agnes still in her nightgown, with a shawl thrown over her shoulders and her hair in its braid. There were no flowers. There was no music. The Reverend read from his worn Bible by memory as much as sight and asked the necessary questions, and they gave the necessary answers. When the Reverend said, "You may," and then seemed to think better of it in this particular circumstance and cleared his throat and said instead, "Gideon, she's your wife." Gideon gave a single, jerky nod and looked at Evelyn with an expression she couldn't decode, somewhere between gratitude and apology and something else, something more complicated. Agnes Blount pressed a cup of hot coffee into Evelyn's hands without being asked. It was the kindest thing anyone did for her that night. They left before midnight. Evelyn had 1 hour to go back to her room and pack. She moved through the small space she'd lived in for 4 years with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has made peace with not having much. 2 wool dresses, A heavy coat better than the one she'd worn tonight. Her sewing kit. 3 books. She would have taken more, but there was only so much she could carry on horseback. The photograph of her husband Thomas, and beside it, the smaller photograph of their son Samuel, who had been 3 years old when the fever took him, and whose face she could still reconstruct from memory, but preferred, when she could, to look at directly. She wrapped both photographs in a piece of flannel and put them at the bottom of her bag. She took the coat off the hook by the door. Samuel's coat. She held it for a moment, her cheek against the wool, breathing through it. Then she folded it carefully and packed it too. She left owing 2 weeks of rent. She left a note for Mrs. Hargrove, who owned the laundry and had employed her for 3 years. She stood for a moment in the doorway of the empty room and looked at the place she had been trying to call home and found, to her mild surprise, that she felt almost nothing about leaving it. That might mean something, she thought, or it might just mean she was numb from the cold. Gideon was waiting with the horses when she came downstairs. He had a bay gelding for himself and a smaller gray mare he'd apparently borrowed or rented from somewhere. Evelyn didn't ask. He looked at her single bag and didn't comment on it. He helped her mount without making it awkward, just offered a hand automatically, the gesture of a practical man rather than a gallant one. They rode out of Black Hollow in silence, heading north toward the mountain. For the first mile, Evelyn focused on the horse and on staying warm and on the simple mechanical task of moving through a dark, frozen landscape. The trail climbed steadily and the trees thickened around them, black shapes against a sky that was clearer than it had been all week, the stars out in force over the Wyoming peaks. After a while, Gideon spoke without turning his head. "I appreciate what you did tonight." "I haven't done anything yet." "You said yes, in front of everyone." A pause. That took something. Evelyn considered that. The lamplight from town was long gone behind them, and the darkness ahead was the kind of darkness that people who've lived their whole lives in cities never quite believe is real. "Tell me about them," she said. "Lucas and Maisie. Tell me more than what you said in the saloon." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then, "Lucas is smart. Too smart. He's the kind of boy who notices everything and doesn't miss much. And right now everything he notices is bad, so he's in a constant state of..." He searched for the word. Outrage, almost. Like the whole world has done him a specific wrong, and he hasn't decided yet what to do about it. "He's grieving," Evelyn said. "Yes, but he doesn't call it that. He calls it everything else." Gideon's voice was even, describing this the way he'd describe animal behavior, observational, careful, trying to understand something he didn't have the instinct for. He'll pick a fight over nothing, supper being the wrong thing, a log falling off the pile, something that doesn't matter at all. And then right in the middle of it, he'll just stop. And you can see something in his face go very far away, and you know it's actually happening, but he's not ready for you to say so. Evelyn knew that particular look. She'd seen it in her own mirror for about a year after Thomas died. And Maisie? Something changed in Gideon's voice. A slight roughening, barely perceptible. "Maisie is..." He stopped, started again. "She doesn't say much. She watches everything. She has this doll. It came with her from the wagon, this little wooden doll. One of its arms broke in the wreck. She carries it everywhere. She hasn't let it out of her hand since October." He paused. "I tried to fix the arm once. She cried like I was trying to take it from her, so I left it." Evelyn looked at the dark trail ahead of them. "Did you try to fix it, or did you try to take it away to fix it?" Silence. He stopped again. "I took it to look at the joint." "She doesn't want it fixed by someone else," Evelyn said. "She wants to hold it the way it is because it's hers and it came from before, from her real life." She paused. "Don't try to fix it again, not unless she asks." Gideon said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's the kind of thing I don't know." "I know," she said, not unkindly. They rode on. The trail climbed higher and the wind picked up, and Evelyn pulled her coat tighter and didn't complain about it. Around 2 a.m, Gideon said, "There," and she looked up from the trail and saw the orange glow of a window through the trees, a cabin window, a fire burning inside, and the sight of that warm light in all that cold dark did something involuntary to her chest. She didn't realize her horse had slowed until Gideon glanced back at her. "You all right?" "Fine. she said, and pressed her heels in gently and caught up to him. The cabin was exactly what he'd described. 2 rooms, solid built, a covered porch with firewood stacked against the wall in a neat, organized pile that suggested a man who took practical preparation seriously, even if he took nothing else seriously. A barn further back in the clearing, barely visible in the dark. The main door, heavy and well-fitted, opened onto the largest room. The fire still burning in the stone hearth, the space simply furnished with a table, 2 chairs, a short bench, iron pots hung from a bar over the fire, and on a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, under a mountain of blankets, 2 shapes. Evelyn stopped inside the door. Lucas was on the outside of the bed, facing the room, as though even in sleep he was keeping watch. He was thin, dark-haired, his face carrying even in sleep a faint tension around the brow and jaw. One hand rested on top of the blanket, half open. Maisie was pressed against the wall, so small she barely made a shape under the blankets. Her dark hair spread out against the pillow. One tiny hand clutched the wooden doll to her chest. Gideon stepped past Evelyn, moving with a quietness that seemed at odds with his size, and added 2 logs to the fire. He straightened and turned and found Evelyn standing exactly where he'd left her, still looking at the children. "They've been sleeping in the main room since the cold set in," he said quietly. "The second room's mine. You can have it." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She was looking at Maisie's hand, the tiny fingers wrapped around the broken doll. She was doing the math again that she'd done in the saloon, the terrible arithmetic of loss. How old Maisie was, how old Samuel would have been, the gap between them, the years that didn't add up to anything good. She swallowed. "I'll sleep in here," she said, "in case they wake." Gideon looked at her. "You sure?" "Yes." She set her bag down by the bench and started unbuttoning her coat. "Do you have an extra blanket?" He got her one from a chest against the wall and set it on the bench without further comment. He paused at the door to his room, his hand on the frame. For a moment she thought he might say something, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. But he just nodded once. That small, precise nod she was already beginning to recognize, and went through the door and pulled it mostly closed behind him. Evelyn sat on the bench for a while in the firelight, listening to the sound of the wind outside and the sound of the children breathing and the occasional pop and shift of the logs in the hearth. This is real, she thought. This is actually happening. She wasn't sure if she meant it as a warning to herself or a reassurance. She decided it didn't matter which. It was true either way. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat there in the warmth and the firelight while the Wyoming winter howled against the walls. And she watched over 2 children who didn't know she existed yet. And she thought about the long chain of choices and griefs and accidents and moments that had brought her to this particular bench in this particular place. A wife of 11 minutes, a stranger in someone else's home, with no idea what was coming next. She was more awake than she'd been in years. She was still sitting there when Maisie stirred just before dawn. The little girl turned over, blinked twice in the firelight, and found Evelyn watching her. Her eyes went wide, dark brown eyes, enormous in her small face, and she clutched the doll tighter and pressed herself back against Lucas's sleeping shoulder. Evelyn didn't move. She kept her voice low and even. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Evelyn. I'm sorry if I scared you." Maisie stared at her. She didn't respond. "I'm a friend of Mr. Crow's," Evelyn said. "I came last night when you were sleeping. I didn't want to wake you." She paused. "Is that your doll?" A barely perceptible nod. "She's pretty," Evelyn said. "What's her name?" Silence. Then, so quiet, Evelyn almost missed it. "Clara." "Clara," Evelyn repeated. "That's a good name." Maisie looked at her for a long, measuring moment with those serious brown eyes. Then she looked at the door to Gideon's room, then back at Evelyn. "Are you staying?" she said. It was the same question Evelyn had asked Gideon in the saloon, nearly. "If I stay?" She felt the echo of it. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I'm staying." Maisie considered this with the gravity of a child who has learned not to take things for granted. Then she shifted slightly on the bed, not quite making room but clearly not closing off the space either. Evelyn sat quietly and watched the fire and waited for the rest of the family to wake up. Outside, the snow had started again. Lucas woke up angry.
It came as no surprise, given what Gideon had said on the trail, but the immediacy of it was still startling. One moment he was asleep, and the next he was sitting up, blinking at Evelyn with eyes that went from confusion to suspicion to something that looked very much like fury in the span of about 4 seconds. "Who are you?" he said. Not rudely exactly, the demand of someone who had decided the world didn't get to ambush him anymore.
Evelyn Mercer.
She stopped herself. Evelyn Crow. I married Mr. Crow last night. The fury in Lucas's face sharpened. He didn't say anything about that. It was a quick decision. Why? Evelyn looked at him steadily. He was 8 years old and he was staring at her like he was prepared to argue with whatever she said, and she felt, unexpectedly, a sharp tenderness for him, for the exhausting labor of being this vigilant about everything, all the time, at 8 years old.
Because of you and Maisie, she said simply. There's a judge coming to decide where you'll live, and the best chance you have of staying here is if Mr. Crow has a wife. So I said yes. Lucas stared at her. She hadn't softened it or wrapped it in reassurance. She had told him the truth, and he was clearly trying to find the angle, the lie inside it, and not finding one. You don't know us, he said. No, she agreed. Not yet. The door to Gideon's room opened and Gideon came through, dressed, hair still damp from the water barrel, and stopped when he saw Evelyn and Lucas looking at each other. You're up, he said to Lucas, with the particular flatness of a man who was not a natural conversationalist before the sun was fully risen. She says she married you, Lucas said. She did. Last night? Last night? Lucas looked from Gideon to Evelyn and back again. Why didn't you tell me you were going to do that? Gideon sat down at the table and reached for the coffee pot. Didn't know I was going to until I was doing it. This was apparently honest enough to satisfy some internal test in Lucas, because his shoulders dropped fractionally. He was still watching Evelyn with wariness that wasn't going anywhere fast, but the immediate crisis of suspicion had passed. Maisie had climbed out of the bed during this exchange and was standing at the edge of the table, still clutching Clara. She looked at Evelyn. Then she walked to the bench where Evelyn was sitting and, without preamble, climbed up and sat beside her, close enough that their arms were touching. She said nothing. She just sat there. Gideon saw it. Something moved through his face quickly. Relief, maybe, or something he didn't have a name for. And then he looked back at his coffee. Lucas saw it too. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned away and started pulling on his boots with the aggressive focus of someone trying not to feel the thing they were feeling. Outside, the snow was coming down in earnest now, the wind pushing it sideways across the clearing, and the fire popped steadily in the hearth. And it was not warm exactly. Not a warm moment in any easy sense of the word. But something was alive in that cold room that hadn't been there before. Not a family. Not yet. But something that might, under the right conditions, eventually become one. The day they arrived in Black Hollow for the hearing was 4 days later. 4 days in which the snow fell intermittently, and the four of them learned each other's edges the way you learn the furniture in a dark room, by running into it. Lucas and Gideon argued twice about wood-chopping duties, once about whether Lucas was old enough to carry the rifle on trail, and once about nothing at all that had a name. Evelyn stayed out of it both times and let Gideon absorb Lucas's anger, because she could see that what Lucas needed more than anything was for the large, immovable man to remain large and immovable when shouted at. And Gideon, without understanding it analytically, was doing exactly that. Maisie sat with Evelyn most of the days, watching her cook and mend and tend the fire. Not talking much, but present with a quality of attention that Evelyn found both sweet and slightly heartbreaking. On the second evening, she brought Clara to Evelyn and held her out. Evelyn looked at the broken arm. She looked at Maisie. "Do you want me to try?" she said. Maisie looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she nodded. Evelyn spent an hour that evening fixing the joint with a piece of wire from Gideon's workbench and a strip of thin leather, Maisie watching every move with complete attention, never once letting go of the doll. She held Clara through the whole repair, repositioning her grip as Evelyn worked. When it was done, the arm wasn't perfect, slightly stiff, but it moved. Maisie flexed the arm back and forth 3 times. Then she looked at Evelyn, and something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Gideon, watching from the corner with a piece of wood half carved in his hands, set the carving down and looked at the fire. That night, for the first time since October, Maisie didn't cry herself to sleep. Nobody mentioned it, but everyone heard it, the silence where the crying usually was. And in that small cabin on the side of a Wyoming mountain, with the snow falling again outside and the fire burning low, the four of them lay in that silence, and each one felt it differently, and none of them said a word. The morning they rode for Black Hollow, Evelyn stood at the cabin door and watched Gideon lift Maisie onto the horse with a gentleness he seemed almost embarrassed by, his huge hands careful and precise around the little girl's waist. Lucas was already mounted, straight-backed and serious, wearing a look of determined courage that he'd been practicing, Evelyn suspected, since he woke up. She stood beside Gideon as he checked the horse's rigging, and she said quietly, "Whatever happens today, we come home together," he said. She looked at him. "All four of us," he said. "That's the only way this ends." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice quite enough to add anything to that. They rode down the mountain toward Black Hollow and toward whatever judgment waited for them there. Black Hollow in late November was not a forgiving place to arrive looking for mercy. The town had a way of reminding you of your smallness, the mountains pressing down on it from three sides, the sky in winter a low gray ceiling that sat on top of everything and let no light in from the sides. The main street was half-frozen mud, and the buildings along it had a hunched, weathered quality, like men who'd been standing in wind too long. When the Crow family rode in that morning, Gideon in front, Lucas and Maisie on the smaller horse, Evelyn beside them, the people who saw them on the street did not look away quickly enough to hide their surprise. Word had spread, of course. Word always spread in a town this size. They all knew about the saloon, about Evelyn's yes, about the midnight ceremony. What they hadn't expected, Evelyn thought, was to see them looking like they'd been living together longer than 4 days. Maisie asleep against Lucas's shoulder, his arm around her automatically. Gideon riding slightly ahead, eyes already scanning the street for the courthouse, for trouble. Evelyn upright in her saddle, her face set. She felt their eyes and ignored them. The hearing was scheduled for 10 in the morning before Judge Harlan Cates, a circuit court judge who passed through the Wyoming territories twice a year and had, by all accounts, seen enough frontier strangeness that very little surprised him anymore. The courthouse was a single large room in a wood-framed building near the end of Main Street, with 2 rows of benches for observers and a raised platform at the front where the judge sat behind a heavy desk. Evelyn had never been inside it. She found it colder than she expected, and smaller. There were already people seated on the benches when they arrived. Townspeople who'd come to watch, some out of concern, some out of pure curiosity. She recognized a few faces. Most of them nodded at her, or looked away depending on where they stood on the question of Gideon Crow's fitness as a guardian. Across the room, near the front bench on the right side, sat a man she hadn't seen before. Calvin Voss was not what she'd expected from the name and reputation. She'd expected someone rough, loud, physically imposing in the way that men who rely on intimidation usually are. Instead, Voss was neat, almost fastidiously so, in a dark coat with brass buttons, his hair combed close to his head, his hands folded in his lap. He was perhaps 50, with a square, unremarkable face and eyes that were the light, flat color of creek water in winter. He looked, more than anything else, like a businessman reviewing paperwork. He glanced at Gideon when they entered, and then at the children, and then at Evelyn. And the glance was brief and assessing and utterly without warmth, and Evelyn felt something tighten in her stomach. Gideon didn't look at him at all. They took their seats on the left side of the room. Lucas sat between Gideon and Evelyn, his back straight and his hands in his lap, wearing the expression of a boy who had decided to be older than he was. Maisie sat on Evelyn's other side, pressed against her arm, Clara tucked inside her coat. Judge Cates came in without ceremony, settled himself behind the desk, and looked at the room over a pair of reading spectacles. "We're here on the matter of guardianship for Lucas James Alderton, age 8, and Maisie Ruth Alderton, age 5, following the deaths of their parents, Robert and Helen Alderton, in October of this year." He opened the folder in front of him and scanned it. "Mr. Voss, you filed this petition. Your counsel will present first." Voss's lawyer was a thin man named Rutherford, who'd apparently ridden up from Cheyenne at Voss's expense, which told Evelyn something about how seriously Voss was taking this. Rutherford stood and presented his case in the precise, practiced manner of a man who does this for money and does it well. He described Gideon as an isolated mountain recluse with a history of violent altercation. There had apparently been an incident 2 years prior involving a competing trapper that had resulted in a broken jaw, a fact Rutherford delivered with particular emphasis. He described the cabin as unsuitable for children, the environment as dangerous, and Gideon's sudden marriage as transparently tactical. This union, Rutherford said, not looking at Evelyn but clearly addressing the room, was arranged in a saloon at midnight less than a week ago by a man who, by his own admission, had no wife and no intention of seeking one until the legal proceedings made it advantageous. The woman in question— Now he did look at Evelyn, briefly. A widow with no children, no property, and no established means of support, agreed on impulse to a transaction that benefits Mr. Crow's legal position while leaving these children's long-term welfare entirely to chance. Evelyn kept her face still. Under the bench, her hand found Maisie's and held it. "My client," Rutherford continued, "offers these children stability, a proper placement in an institution in Omaha with qualified staff, educational resources, and the kind of structured environment that— Separate them?" Lucas said. Every head in the room turned. Lucas was leaning slightly forward, looking directly at Rutherford with an expression that had none of the courteous restraint that the adults around him were managing. He was 8 years old and he sounded very close to the edge of something. "They'd separate us." He said it. He said institution. "Lucas," Gideon said quietly, "that means they'd separate us." Lucas's voice was steady, but it cost him something. "They'd put us in different places and we wouldn't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. He was staring at his hands now, on the bench in front of him. Judge Cates looked at the boy for a moment. He said, not unkindly, "Son, you'll get to speak, just a little longer." Lucas pressed his lips together and sat back. He was shaking slightly. You could see it in his shoulders if you knew to look. And Evelyn reached past Maisie and put her hand briefly on his arm without making a production of it. He didn't shake her off. Gideon's lawyer, a local man named Haskell, who was considerably less polished than Rutherford, but knew the territory and knew Judge Cates, stood and made the counter-argument. He spoke about the months Gideon had already kept the children alive and fed in harsh conditions. He argued that the sudden marriage, whatever its origins, had produced a household that was now functioning. He called the first witness. The blacksmith, Dan Corey, was not a man who chose his words carefully. He stood at the front of the room with his hat in his hands and said plainly that he'd seen the Alderton children in Gideon's company twice since October, and that both times they'd looked fed and clothed and no worse than any other kids in winter. "Better than some," he added, and left it at that. A woman named Ruth Halsey, who ran the dry goods store, said she'd sold Evelyn flour and salt pork on credit 2 days prior and had found her to be a woman of sound judgment who knew what she was feeding 4 people through a Wyoming winter, which Ruth apparently considered a meaningful character reference. Then Haskell said, "I'd like to call Frank Dobbins," and the room shifted in a way that Evelyn felt rather than saw. Frank Dobbins was the old trapper, the one from the saloon, the one who'd laughed. He was maybe 65, lean and weathered, with a beard that hadn't seen a scissors in some time, and he walked to the front of the room with the deliberate care of a man whose knees had logged too many miles in cold country. He looked at Gideon as he passed, and Gideon looked back, and something passed between them that wasn't forgiveness exactly, but was something adjacent to it. Dobbins cleared his throat. "I've known Gideon Crow going on 12 years, he said. "We've had our differences. I'll admit I laughed when he came in the saloon the other night." He paused. "I stopped laughing when I heard what he said. Any man who spends 2 months keeping children alive in the high country through the first snowfall and then rides down to get himself a wife before a judge because he can't figure out any other way to protect them." He looked at the judge. "That's not a man I'd call unfit, Your Honor. That's a man doing the best he knows how for somebody else's children. And in my experience, that's about as much as you can ask of any person." He sat back down. Voss's lawyer started to object on some technical grounds that Evelyn stopped following because Maisie had just turned and pressed her face against Evelyn's arm, and the weight of that small head against her was doing something to her concentration. Judge Cates listened to another 20 minutes of procedural argument, asked several questions of both sides, and then removed his spectacles and looked at the 2 children on the left bench. "I'd like to speak to Lucas and Maisie directly," he said. Rutherford started to object. The judge looked at him, and he stopped. Lucas stood up without being asked, which the judge seemed to appreciate. He walked to the front of the room and stood before the judge's desk with his hands at his sides, chin up, and Evelyn thought she had never seen anyone work so hard to seem older than they were. "Lucas," the judge said, "I'm going to ask you a plain question, and I want a plain answer. No one in this room is going to be angry at you for anything you say. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Where do you want to live?" Lucas's throat moved. He looked just for a second at Gideon. Not at the judge, not at Voss, not at Rutherford or Haskell or the watching townspeople. At Gideon, who was looking back at him with no expression that promised anything, no nod or reassurance, just looking, letting the boy make his own answer. "With them," Lucas said. "With Gideon and Evelyn." He paused. "I want to stay with Maisie." "Thank you," the judge said. "You can sit down." Maisie had to be coaxed up by Evelyn, who walked with her to the front and crouched down beside her while the judge leaned forward over his desk to be closer to the child's level. "Maisie," he said, his voice softer than it had been. "Do you know where you want to live?" Maisie looked at him. Then she looked at Evelyn, who was right beside her, and then she turned back to the judge and clutched Clara a little tighter. "With Evelyn," she whispered. "Why's that?" Maisie thought about it with the solemnity of someone for whom the question had a real and specific answer. Then she said, very quietly, "Because they feel like home." Evelyn looked at the floor. She was not going to do this here, in front of everyone. She was absolutely not going to. She pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth for a moment and breathed carefully through her nose. The judge looked at Maisie for a long moment. Then he sat back and put his spectacles on and looked at the papers in front of him. "I've heard enough," he said. "I'm granting temporary guardianship to Gideon and Evelyn Crow, to be reviewed in 6 months following a welfare assessment." He looked over his spectacles at Voss. "Mr. Voss, I'd suggest that your energy might be better directed elsewhere. We're done here." Calvin Voss was already standing, speaking quietly to Rutherford, who was making notes. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He picked up his hat from the bench beside him, and as he turned toward the door, his eyes passed over Gideon. Just for a moment, a flat, assessing look with absolutely no concession in it. He wasn't done. Evelyn knew it as soon as she saw that look. A man like Voss didn't accept losing in front of a room of people and then simply redirect his energy elsewhere. He regrouped. He found another way. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Lucas had pushed past Gideon and walked straight out the courthouse door, and Evelyn found him around the side of the building, standing in the narrow space between the courthouse wall and the next building, his back to her, his shoulders shaking. She stopped. She didn't go around to look at his face. She just stood behind him and said nothing. After a moment, Lucas said, "I'm not crying." "All right," Evelyn said, "I'm just—" He stopped. "My throat hurts." That happens sometimes. Another silence. The wind moved between the buildings. From the street came the sound of voices and footsteps, the town resuming its business. "What if the 6 months comes and the judge changes his mind?" Lucas said. His voice had leveled out, but barely. "He won't," Evelyn said. "You don't know that." "You're right," she said. I don't know that, but I know that we're going to spend the next 6 months making sure he doesn't have any reason to." She paused. "And I know that whatever happens, Maisie stays with you. I'd burn every bridge I've got before I let them separate you two." Lucas was quiet. Then he turned around and his eyes were red, but his face was composed, the tightly held composure of a boy teaching himself not to fall apart in front of people. "You really mean that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded slowly. He wasn't ready to say anything else. She could see that, and she didn't push. She just waited while he got himself back together, and when he was ready, he walked out from between the buildings without looking back at her, and she followed him back to where Gideon and Maisie were waiting with the horses. Gideon looked at Lucas. Lucas looked at Gideon. Neither of them said anything. Gideon put his hand briefly on top of the boy's head, an awkward gesture, big hand on dark hair, and then removed it, and Lucas reached up and touched the spot where the hand had been, and then pretended he hadn't. It was not a perfect moment. It was clumsy and insufficient, and it was enough. They rode home. The weeks that followed were hard in ways that had nothing to do with Voss.
The mountain winter pressed down on the cabin with the serious, indifferent weight of something that had been doing this for centuries and would keep doing it long after they were all gone. Storms came in overnight and locked them in for days at a stretch. The woodpile went down faster than Gideon had planned. The gray mare Evelyn had ridden down from town turned out to have a soft shoe that needed replacing, which meant a half-day trip in poor conditions to the nearest smithy. And then there was the simple daily friction of four people who didn't know each other well enough yet to navigate each other without collision. Gideon was not easy to live with. Evelyn had understood this in theory from the saloon and confirmed it in practice within the first week back at the cabin. He was not mean. She'd been half prepared for mean, given his reputation, and he wasn't that. But he was solitary in a way that went all the way down, solitary like a reflex, and living in close quarters with three other people was visibly costing him something every day. He went out to the barn or the tree line at odd hours, not because anything needed doing there, but clearly because he needed 10 minutes without walls and voices. He forgot entirely that mealtimes were something children anticipated and had opinions about. He communicated preferences in monosyllables that Evelyn had to learn to read like a foreign language. She was not easy to live with either. She knew this about herself. She had lived alone long enough that her patterns had calcified around her. The specific way she arranged the cooking irons, the precise time she needed to sit quietly in the mornings before she was ready to talk to anyone, the absolute private rule that nobody touched the flannel-wrapped photographs in her bag. These were not reasonable things to insist on in a small cabin with an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old. She had to unlearn them quickly, and she didn't always manage it gracefully. She and Gideon argued twice in the first 2 weeks. Once about Lucas being allowed on the high trail alone to check trap lines. She said not yet. He said the boy was capable, and the disagreement ended with Gideon going to the barn and not coming back in for 2 hours. Once about the children's sleep schedule, which Gideon had apparently never imposed and Evelyn believed firmly in, and which resolved itself in the middle of the night when they both appeared in the doorway of the main room at the same moment, woken by the same noise, and found Maisie sitting up in bed from a nightmare. They looked at each other across the dark room and called a temporary truce without saying so, and Evelyn sat with Maisie until she fell back asleep while Gideon added wood to the fire. And afterward, they didn't revisit either argument. But the small things added up, the way small things do. Maisie started sleeping through the night more often than not. Lucas came in from the woodpile one afternoon and set the split logs in the indoor stack with a precision that was a direct imitation of Gideon, which Evelyn caught Gideon noticing. He was teaching the boy to carve in the evenings, the two of them at the table with their respective pieces of wood and their knives, not talking much but present in a way that was its own kind of conversation. And one afternoon, when a storm had locked them in for the third day running, and Maisie was restless, and Lucas was sullen, and Gideon was so far into his own head that he'd failed to respond to 2 questions directed at him, Evelyn put a pot of water on the fire and announced they were going to bake something. "We don't have the stuff for that," Lucas said. "We have flour, salt, and lard. That's enough for biscuits." "I've never made biscuits," Maisie said, in a tone that suggested this was both a confession and a question. "I know. That's why we're doing it." Gideon looked up from whatever middle distance he'd been staring at. "I can do that," he said. Everyone looked at him. "I can make biscuits," he said, with a slight defensiveness that suggested he was surprised to be doubted. "I've been feeding myself for 12 years. You don't think I know how to make biscuits?" "Show me," Maisie said. It was not by any objective measure a great baking session. Gideon's biscuits were flat, and Evelyn's were too salty, and Lucas dropped an entire portion of the dough on the floor and then picked it up and used it anyway. And Maisie ate 2 of the finished products raw-ish in the middle because she couldn't wait. But the cabin was warm from the fire and smelled like something other than wood smoke for the first time in weeks. And Lucas laughed, actually laughed, not the careful, guarded, near smile he usually allowed himself, but a real laugh. When one of Gideon's biscuits hit the pan and spread flat as a hat, and Gideon looked at the boy's laughing face with an expression that he quickly redirected toward the fire. Later, when the children were asleep and Evelyn was cleaning up, she heard Gideon at the table behind her. "Evelyn." She turned. He was sitting with his hands on the table, looking at them. It was the posture of a man about to say something that he'd been rehearsing, which was unusual enough that she set down what she was doing. "I don't say things well," he said. "I know that."
So I'm going to say this once and probably badly, and then not say it again for a while. He looked up from his hands. I'm glad you said yes. In the saloon. I'm glad you said yes. She looked at him for a moment. The fire was low, the cabin quiet, and he was watching her with those pale gray eyes that she'd spent weeks learning to read. I know, she said finally. That's all I... He stopped, nodded. That's all. She turned back to the dishes. Behind her, she heard him get up from the table, bank the fire for the night, and go to his room. She stood at the wash basin for a moment, looking at nothing. The feeling in her chest was not happiness exactly. It was more complicated than that, more uncertain, with edges that could catch if you weren't careful. But it was warm. And after 4 years of cold, she had learned to take warmth in whatever form it came. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. Through the small window, the sky was clear and full of stars, and the mountains stood black and enormous against them. And somewhere out in the silence, a wolf called once and then went quiet, and the cabin held its heat against the dark. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried up the mountain by a postal rider who looked like he'd rather have been anywhere else, and who handed the envelope to Gideon at the cabin door without making eye contact before turning his horse around and heading back down the trail at a pace that suggested urgency. Gideon looked at the seal on the envelope. He stood there in the doorway for a long moment, snow on his shoulders from where he'd been splitting wood, not opening it. Evelyn came to stand beside him. She read the return address and felt the warmth of the morning drain out of her. Wyoming Territorial Court, Honorable H. Cates presiding, re. Matter of Alderton guardianship. The 6 months isn't up, she said. No. Gideon turned the envelope over. It's not. He opened it. They read it together, which had become a habit without either of them deciding it would be. The letter was precise and formal, and said, between its careful legal phrases, that a new petition had been filed by Calvin Voss challenging the temporary guardianship on the grounds of environmental unsuitability and parental instability, requesting an emergency hearing to be held in Black Hollow in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He found a new angle, Evelyn said. He found the children. Gideon folded the letter back along its creases. His voice was flat in the way it got when he was keeping something compressed. He found out the arrangement was still temporary. He's been waiting for that. Behind them in the cabin, Lucas and Maisie were at the table. Maisie was drawing something on a scrap of paper with a charcoal stick. Lucas was pretending to whittle and actually watching the doorway because he always watched doorways when something felt wrong. What does it say? Lucas asked. Gideon turned around. He looked at Lucas with the particular expression of a man deciding how much truth an 8-year-old can be handed at once. And then, because he'd learned something about Lucas in the past 2 months, he handed him all of it. Voss is taking us back to court, he said. He wants a new hearing. Lucas set down the whittling knife with careful precision. Why? Because the first one didn't go his way. Can he do that? Apparently, yes. Maisie had looked up from her drawing. She was watching Gideon's face the way she always watched faces, reading something in the set of it that most adults would have missed. She looked at Evelyn. Then she looked back at her drawing and pressed the charcoal down harder. Then we go back, Lucas said, and we win again. Gideon nodded once. That's the plan. But standing in the cabin doorway with the letter in his hand, watching Evelyn's face do the careful, composed thing it did when she was frightened and not going to show it, Gideon understood something he hadn't before. The first hearing had been about proving a minimum, that he wasn't unfit, that the children were fed and safe. This one would be different. Voss had had 2 months to prepare. He would come at them from a different direction, and he would come harder. The problem was that winning a legal fight in a frontier territory required things Gideon had never needed before. It required people who were willing to stand up in a room and say something on your behalf. It required community. It required the kind of social capital that a man who'd spent a decade in the high country, accumulating nothing but enemies and a reputation for violence, did not naturally have. It required Evelyn. She knew it too. Could see it in the way she took the letter from him and read it a second time, already thinking, already calculating. Who she knew in Black Hollow, who might be persuaded, who owed favors to whom. I'll go into town tomorrow, she said. I'll come with you. No. She looked at him directly. You'll stay with the children. In town you make people nervous, Gideon. It's the truth, and I'm not saying it to be unkind. You stay here and I'll go talk to people." He held her gaze. He didn't like it, and she knew he didn't, and she waited him out. "Fine," he said. She went to town the next morning alone. What followed was 3 of the most dispiriting days Evelyn had spent since the immediate aftermath of Thomas's death, which was saying something. She went door to door in Black Hollow with the quiet, methodical approach of someone who had nothing to offer but the truth and was offering it anyway. She sat in Ruth Halsey's dry goods store for an hour, explaining the situation. She found Earl Duggan at the saloon before it opened and talked to him over the bar while he stocked shelves. She visited the Reverend and Agnes, who listened carefully and said little. Most people were sympathetic. Most people said things like, "Of course, those poor children, and it's a terrible shame Voss won't leave well enough alone," and then found reasons why they couldn't personally appear in a courtroom and say so. Voss had money and influence in this territory in ways that extended past the obvious. He owned paper on several of the buildings on Main Street. He had relationships with men who supplied half the town's winter goods. Standing up against him in public had costs that Evelyn understood and couldn't entirely argue against, because these were people with their own lives and their own fragile circumstances, and courage is considerably easier to ask for than to offer. She rode back up the mountain on the second night feeling like she'd been scraping at a locked door with her fingernails. On the third day she went back, and she sat in the broken spur for an hour, not talking to anyone, just sitting there with a cup of Earl's terrible coffee, thinking about Maisie's face when she'd looked at the letter, the way she'd pressed the charcoal down harder on her paper, as if she could press hard enough to make everything stay still. Frank Dobbins sat down across from her. She looked up. He was in his usual state of calculated dishevelment, but his eyes were sharp, and he was looking at her with something that was either pity or respect, and she didn't particularly want either. "You've been at this 3 days," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Getting anywhere?" She considered lying and decided against it. "Not much." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside the window, Main Street went about its business in the flat winter light. "Voss owns paper on my place, too," he said. "You should know that before you think I'm doing you a favor." "I know," she said. "Still." He set the cup down. "I testified once. I'll do it again." He looked at her steadily. "And I'll talk to some people. I'm not promising anything, but I'll talk to them." It wasn't enough to build a case on. She knew that. She thanked him and rode home and told Gideon what she had and hadn't managed, and he listened without comment, which she appreciated. Then, 9 days before the hearing, everything shifted. The fever started with Maisie on a Thursday night. It began the way these things always begin. The child a little quieter than usual at supper, a little less interested in her food, pressing herself against Evelyn's side with the boneless quality of someone whose body is working hard on something else. Evelyn put her hand to Maisie's forehead and felt the heat there, and her stomach went cold even as she kept her voice steady. "Come on, little one, let's get you to bed." By midnight, the fever had climbed. By 2 a.m, Maisie was shaking under every blanket in the cabin, and her skin was burning so hot it was frightening to touch, and she was saying things that didn't make sense, fragments of words, her parents' names, something about Clara that came out in a broken whisper. Gideon was already pulling on his coat. "There's a doctor in Hatchet Crossing," Evelyn said, not looking up from Maisie. "Dr. Aldous Reed, he's the nearest one. That's 14 miles. "I know how far it is." He looked at Maisie. Something passed over his face, something controlled and necessary in the way that fear has to be controlled when there's action to take. "I'll be back before morning." "The trail—" "I know the trail." He was already at the door. "Keep the fire up. Keep her covered. If the fever gets worse before I get back—" He stopped. He didn't have anything to add to that sentence that was useful. "I'll be back," he said. He went out into the black of the Wyoming night, and Evelyn heard the barn door, the sounds of a horse being tacked in a hurry, and then the rhythm of hooves on frozen ground diminishing into the dark, and then gone. Lucas was awake. He'd been awake since midnight, sitting on his side of the bed, watching his sister with an expression that Evelyn recognized as the face of someone running the math on an outcome they couldn't control. "She had a fever before," Lucas said. "When we were little. Before." He meant before the accident, before the world changed. "She got better." "She'll get better this time too," Evelyn said. "You don't know that." She looked at him. "No," she said. "I don't." But I know that your job right now is to help me keep her comfortable. And I know that Gideon is riding 14 miles in the dark to get a doctor. And I know that worrying about what we don't know doesn't help Maisie right now." She held out her hand. "Come hold her hand." Lucas crossed the room and sat beside his sister and took her small burning hand in both of his, and he sat there through the night with the stiff-backed determination of someone who has appointed themselves to a post and will not leave it. Evelyn worked. She kept the fire up. She used cold cloths on Maisie's face and neck, changing them as they warmed, moving with the calm efficiency of someone who has nothing to spare on panic. When Maisie cried out in the strange, half-awake state the fever produced, Evelyn talked to her, low, continuous, about nothing in particular, just the sound of a steady voice saying, "I'm here, I'm right here, you're all right," over and over, which is what you do when there's nothing else to do. At one point in the deep middle of the night, Maisie opened her eyes and looked directly at Evelyn with that sudden, startling clarity that sick children sometimes have. "Clara," she said, "she's right here." Evelyn put the doll in Maisie's hand. The little fingers closed around her immediately. "Don't go," Maisie said. She wasn't talking to Clara. "I'm not going anywhere," Evelyn said. "I'm right here." Maisie's eyes closed again. Lucas, on the other side of the bed, looked at Evelyn over his sister's body, and whatever remaining distance there was between them, whatever residual wariness, whatever tested patience, burned off quietly in the heat of that long night like morning frost, and didn't come back. Gideon came back before dawn with Dr. Reed, a compact, serious-faced man who smelled of cold air and moved with the brisk efficiency of someone pulled out of bed for genuine emergencies, often enough that he didn't waste any part of the process. He examined Maisie while Gideon stood at the back of the room with his hat in his hands, and Lucas sat on the bench, and Evelyn gave Reed every detail of the night in precise, orderly sequence. Reed listened. He felt Maisie's pulse. He opened his bag. "Lung fever's my best diagnosis," he said. "Could be worse. Could be a good deal worse." He looked at Evelyn. "You've been managing her well through the night. Keep doing what you're doing. I'll leave medicine. Give it to her every 4 hours without fail, even if she seems better. The second day is usually the worst. If the fever hasn't broken by the third morning, send for me again." "Will it break?" Lucas said from the bench. Reed looked at the boy. He had the grace not to offer false reassurances to an 8-year-old who clearly wouldn't respect them. "Most likely, yes," he said. "She's young, and she was healthy before this. Those things matter." He left medicine and instructions and refused payment that Gideon tried to press on him, saying he'd send a bill in the spring, and then he rode back down the mountain, and they settled in to wait. The second day was, as Reed had promised, the worst. Maisie's fever climbed until the afternoon, and then held at a level that kept everyone silent and careful. Gideon sat by the bed for 6 straight hours, which was the longest Evelyn had ever seen him stay still. He wasn't comfortable with it. He didn't do the right things, didn't know the right words, kept repositioning his big hands in his lap like he couldn't find anywhere to put them that wasn't in the way. But he stayed. He didn't go to the barn or the tree line or any of his usual escapes. He sat there and he stayed. At one point, Maisie woke enough to find him there, and she looked at him for a moment and said, "You smell like horse," with the blunt honesty of the feverish. "I rode 14 miles in the dark," he said. "For me?" A pause. "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Okay," and closed her eyes again as though this was all the information she needed, and she was satisfied with it. Gideon looked at the wall above her head and breathed carefully through his nose. Lucas, watching from across the room, turned away and went to the window and looked out at the snow. The fever broke before dawn on the third day. Evelyn felt it go, felt the heat diminish under her hand, felt Maisie's breathing ease from that tight, labored rhythm into something slower and more natural. And she sat back and put both hands over her face for a moment and just breathed. "Evelyn," Lucas's voice from across the room. "She's all right," Evelyn said from behind her hands. "She's all right." She heard Gideon exhale. It was the most unguarded sound she'd ever heard from him. They did not celebrate. There was nothing left in any of them for celebration. They moved through the rest of that day on the quiet momentum of relief, tending to Maisie, who was weak and confused and demanded Clara with absolute priority, eating a meal that nobody cooked with any particular attention or care, and that tasted, for that reason, like one of the better meals any of them had had. That evening, after the children were asleep, Evelyn sat at the table and began writing letters. Gideon sat across from her in the firelight, not asking, just present. She wrote to every person she'd spoken to in Black Hollow. She wrote plainly and without drama that there was a child on this mountain who had been at death's door 3 days ago and who was alive because a man had ridden 14 miles in the dark on a frozen trail to find a doctor. And she would like them to think about that when they considered what kind of family they were being asked to judge. She wrote the last letter to someone she hadn't yet contacted, someone whose name had appeared in the original court documents as next of kin, listed and then struck through, with a notation that she had declined to take custody. Margaret Whitlock, the children's aunt, the one who had walked away. Evelyn wrote to her anyway because she had run out of other options, and because something in her couldn't leave that door unopened. She sealed the envelopes, stacked them neatly, and set them by the door for the next postal rider. "Who's the last one, too?" Gideon asked. He had very good eyes and had read the name upside down without apparently trying. "Their father's sister," Evelyn said. "She's in St. Louis." He was quiet for a moment. "She didn't come for them." "I know." "So why—" "Because I don't know why she didn't come," Evelyn said. "And until I know that, I don't know if she's an enemy or not." She looked at him. "And right now I can't afford to make enemies out of people who might not be." He considered this. He was getting better at that, at considering her reasoning rather than simply responding to the conclusion. It had taken most of 2 months, but it was happening. "All right," he said. The hearing was 11 days away. They had Dobbins and his uncertain promises, and a handful of letters that might or might not move people who were afraid to be moved. They had each other and the children and a cabin that held heat against the dark. It was not enough, and they both knew it. But they got up the next morning and tended the fire and made breakfast and helped Maisie sit up to eat, and they did not talk about what they didn't have because there was too much to do to stand still, and standing still in a Wyoming winter was, in any case, how you froze. 11 days. They would use every one of them. The morning of the hearing arrived gray and still, the sky the color of old iron, the kind of morning that offers no comfort and no promise. They rode into Black Hollow in the same formation as before, Gideon ahead, Lucas and Maisie together, Evelyn at the flank. But the town they rode into felt different this time, smaller somehow and more watchful. Voss was already in the courthouse when they arrived, and he'd brought reinforcements. Rutherford was back from Cheyenne, and beside him was a second lawyer Evelyn didn't recognize, and behind them were 2 men in good coats who had the look of witnesses paid to be there. She scanned the courtroom from the doorway and counted faces she recognized. Dobbins on the left bench, giving her a small nod. Ruth Halsey, to her surprise, 2 rows back. Earl Dugan at the very end, hat on his knee, looking like he was there under mild protest, but was there nonetheless. Not enough. She could feel Voss's team cataloging the same room she was and reaching the same conclusion. Rutherford opened with an efficiency that suggested he'd refined his arguments in the 2 months between hearings. He had a statement from a territorial welfare assessor, a man named Garrett, who apparently hadn't visited the cabin but had reviewed the case file, describing the mountain environment as isolated to the point of educational deprivation, and Gideon's background as one with a documented pattern of physical violence. He had paperwork. Voss was very good at paperwork. Then Rutherford called his witness, a man in a good coat who introduced himself as a former trapping partner of Gideon's and proceeded to describe, in careful and damning detail, the incident 2 years ago that had resulted in a broken jaw. He made it sound like Gideon had attacked an innocent man. He left out, Evelyn knew from what Gideon had told her, the part where the man had robbed one of Gideon's trap lines and then pulled a knife. Haskell objected. Judge Cates noted the objection and asked Rutherford to move on. Dobbins testified. Ruth Halsey testified, more forcefully than Evelyn had expected, saying that she had known Evelyn Mercer for 3 years and would trust her with her own grandchildren if it came to it, which was the most Ruth Halsey had said in a courtroom in her life, and visibly cost her something. Earl Dugan testified that the children had been in his establishment twice, and both times had seemed healthy, and in Maisie's case, cheerful. It wasn't landing the way it needed to. Evelyn could feel the room's uncertainty like a physical pressure. Voss sat at his table looking at his folded hands with the patience of a man who has done the math and likes where it comes out. Haskell leaned over to Evelyn and said very quietly, "We need something more." "I know," she said. The courtroom door opened. Most people didn't hear it over the ongoing testimony, but Evelyn was facing the right direction, and she saw the woman who came through it, and for a moment she wasn't sure what she was seeing. Margaret Whitlock was perhaps 55, dressed for travel in a coat that spoke of St. Louis money without shouting about it. She was tall, gray-haired, with a face that had the structure of someone who had been striking when young and had grown into something better than that with age. She came through the door and stopped, reading the room quickly and professionally, and her eyes found Evelyn's and then moved to the children, and she went very still for just a moment. Then she walked forward and took a seat in the back row, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Judge Cates noticed her arrival and looked questioningly at both tables. Haskell stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call a witness we weren't certain could attend, Mrs. Margaret Whitlock of St. Louis, the children's aunt." The silence in the room had a particular quality. The quality of a situation changing direction while everyone watches and nobody is quite sure yet which way it's going. Rutherford was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed. She's next of kin to the children in question," Haskell said. "I'd argue her testimony is relevant by definition." Cates looked at Rutherford, then at Margaret Whitlock at the back of the room. "I'll allow it," he said. "Overruled." Margaret Whitlock walked to the front of the courtroom, and she was composed and she was careful, and she told the truth, which turned out to be more complicated than anyone had expected. She had not come for the children in October, she said, because her husband had been dying. She had been in a sick room in St. Louis for 6 weeks while he died slowly, and by the time she'd come up from the other side of that, the children were already on the mountain with Gideon, and the petition was already filed, and she hadn't known what to do. She said this without apparent embarrassment, with the directness of someone past the age of comfortable self-deception. She had thought that perhaps she wasn't the right person, that perhaps a woman who had never had children of her own and had just buried her husband was not what 2 traumatized children needed. She paused. She looked at Lucas and Maisie, who were looking back at her with the careful attention of children assessing a new person. "Robert trusted Gideon," she said. She meant the children's father. "They hunted together for years. Robert said once that if he ever needed someone to stand up for his family when he couldn't, Gideon Crow was the man he'd want." She looked at the judge. "I should have said that 2 months ago. I'm saying it now." She looked at Evelyn then, directly, and Evelyn held her gaze. Something passed between them that was wordless and complete. Recognition, maybe, or the particular understanding of women who have both been close to grief and know what it looks like from the inside. Rutherford cross-examined her for 15 minutes and got very little for his trouble. Then Judge Cates asked the question he'd asked before, the same question to the same 2 children, and this time Maisie didn't whisper. She said it clearly enough that the people in the back row heard her. "Home," she said when the judge asked where she wanted to be. "That's my home." Cates looked at Calvin Voss for a long moment. Voss met his gaze without expression. "Mr. Voss," the judge said, "I reviewed the original petition you filed back in October. The grounds cited were the welfare of these children." He set down his pen. "I'm having some trouble identifying how this proceeding serves that goal. The children are healthy, they have a household, they have community members willing to speak on their behalf, a family member who supports the current arrangement, and the children themselves have expressed clearly and consistently where they wish to be." A pause. "I'm going to ask you directly, what is this actually about?" Voss opened his mouth. "Think carefully before you answer," Cates said. Voss closed his mouth. Something shifted in his face, the first genuine emotion Evelyn had seen from him, and it was not embarrassment but something colder and more practical. The recognition of a man who has pushed as far as this particular situation will allow. "The welfare of the children," he said evenly. "Then their welfare has been addressed." Cates picked up his pen. "Guardianship is confirmed, permanent, and not subject to further challenge on these grounds. We're adjourned." The sound that came from the room was not quite applause and not quite a collective exhale, somewhere between the two. Gideon sat very still at the table for a moment. Then he turned and looked at Evelyn, and she looked back, and neither of them could find the words for what had just happened, so they didn't try. Lucas had already turned around on the bench and was looking at Margaret Whitlock with a complicated expression. Uncertain, not quite suspicious, not quite open. Margaret Whitlock looked back at him. "You look like your father," she said. Lucas's jaw worked. "I know," he said. Outside, Calvin Voss walked past them on the courthouse steps without speaking. He did not look at the children. He looked, very briefly, at Gideon, and in that look was a message that Gideon received and filed away without outward reaction. Evelyn saw it too. She turned to watch Voss walk to his horse, and she felt the particular unease of someone who knows that a thing is not over just because a door has been closed on it. But today was today, and today they had won, and the children were coming home. That was enough. For now, it was enough. They should have been safe after that. That was the reasonable expectation, that a man who had been told twice by a territorial judge to walk away would eventually walk away. People in Black Hollow said as much. Ruth Halsey told Evelyn over the counter of the dry goods store that Voss was a businessman above all else, and businessmen cut their losses when the math stopped working. Frank Dobbins said something similar, less politely, involving a part of Voss's anatomy and the direction he could point it. Evelyn nodded and smiled and rode back up the mountain and told Gideon none of it, because she had seen the look on the courthouse steps, and she didn't believe a word of the reasonable expectation. Gideon had already started quietly reinforcing things. She noticed it without commenting, the way he'd moved the rifle from its corner hook to a peg beside the door where it could be reached without crossing the room, the way he took slightly different routes when he rode out for supplies, varying the timing, the path. Old habits from old years, she suspected, the instincts of a man who had lived long enough in rough country to know that the absence of visible threat is not the same thing as safety. January deepened. The cold became the kind of cold that makes everything else feel minor by comparison. They were a family by now, in every practical sense. The rhythms of the cabin had organized themselves around 4 people rather than 1. The arguments had the particular texture of arguments between people who know each other well enough to be specific rather than just loud. Lucas had started calling Gideon by his first name, which neither of them had agreed on or discussed. It had simply happened one morning over firewood and stuck. Maisie called Evelyn to her face, and something else entirely when she thought no one was listening. Evelyn had heard it twice, a small tentative word that she hadn't reacted to either time because she was afraid that reacting would stop it. Margaret Whitlock had ridden back to St. Louis after the hearing, but she'd left something behind. A letter for Lucas with her address written in it, and a small silver locket that had belonged to the children's mother. Lucas kept the letter folded in the inner pocket of his coat. He didn't talk about it. But Evelyn saw him touch the outside of the pocket sometimes, the way you touch something you want to make sure is still there. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of January when Voss made his move. Gideon had gone out before dawn to check the northern trap line. A full day's ride there and back, not unusual, something he did twice a month when the season was right. He'd told Evelyn the night before, straightforward and practical the way he always was about these things. She'd packed him food. He'd left in the dark. What he hadn't counted on, what none of them had counted on, was that someone had been watching the cabin long enough to know his schedule. Evelyn was inside with the children when she heard the horses. Not one horse, the sound of a rider coming up the trail the way the postal rider came, or the occasional neighbor passing through. Multiple horses, moving with the kind of deliberate pace that wasn't a hurry, but wasn't casual either. She heard it and was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. 3 riders in the clearing. She didn't recognize 2 of them. Hired men, by the look of them. The particular look of men paid to be present and not to ask questions. The 3rd she recognized immediately, even at distance, even though he'd never been to the cabin before. The neat coat, the squared shoulders, the quality of patience in how he sat his horse. Calvin Voss. "Lucas," she said. Her voice was level. "Take Maisie to the back room." Lucas was already on his feet. He'd heard the horses, too. He looked out the window and saw what she saw, and his face went through several things quickly before it settled into something older than his age. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go talk to them." "By yourself?" "Go," she said. "Now. Take your sister and stay in the back room and do not come out unless I call you. Do you understand?" He held her eyes for a moment. Then he took Maisie's hand and went. Evelyn crossed to the door. She unhooked the rifle from the peg, checked the load the way Gideon had shown her, She'd practiced this a dozen times over the past weeks, dry runs in the mornings when the children were occupied, Gideon watching and correcting without making a performance of teaching her. She held the rifle at her side, barrel down, and opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The three men looked at her. Voss looked at the rifle with no visible reaction.
Mrs. Crow, he said. He made her name sound like an assessment. Mr. Voss. She stayed on the porch. The cold hit her immediately. She hadn't stopped for her coat, but she didn't go back for it. My husband isn't here. I know, Voss said. The two hired men had spread slightly, one to either side, not dramatically, just enough to widen the frame. She noticed it and didn't let her eyes track it. She kept her attention on Voss. Then you should come back when he is, she said.
Voss looked at the cabin. He looked at the barn, the tree line, the dimensions of the property with the assessing eye of a man pricing real estate. I want to make you an offer, he said. A reasonable one. The timber on this mountain is worth more than Crow understands, more than he'll ever make trapping. I'm willing to purchase this property at a fair price, a generous price, and relocate your family to better circumstances in town. Better for the children, better schooling, better community. He paused. Better than this. She looked at him. The cold was working through her shirt, and she kept her face still against it. No. You haven't heard the number. It doesn't matter what the number is. Voss tilted his head slightly. Mrs. Crow, I want you to think carefully about your position here. You're a woman alone on a mountain with two children and a husband who isn't home, and what I'm offering is a way out of a situation that is going to become considerably more difficult. He let that sit for a moment. He was not raising his voice or making explicit threats. He was being very precise and very careful, and that Evelyn thought was in some ways worse than a loud man would have been. I'm a patient man, but patience has a shape to it. I'd like to conclude this matter. The hired man on the left had moved his horse slightly closer to the porch. Not much. Enough. Something went very quiet inside Evelyn. Not the quiet of fear. She identified it as something else, something that had been building since October, since the saloon and the midnight ceremony and the mountain and the fever and the courtroom, and it was not afraid of Calvin Voss. It was tired of him. Profoundly, specifically, personally tired of this man and what he represented and the casual assumption in his voice that she could be managed. She raised the rifle, not at Voss, at the ground 12 inches in front of the left hired man's horse. She fired. The sound in the clearing was enormous. The horse screamed and shied violently, nearly unseating its rider, who grabbed for the horn with both hands and swore loudly. The other hired man's horse spooked sideways and churned the snow. Voss's horse skittered, and Voss brought it under control with a tight rein, his jaw hard, the first real expression she'd seen on his face. Not fear, but the sudden recalibration of a man who has miscalculated something. The clearing went quiet except for the horses settling. Evelyn worked the action on the rifle. The spent cartridge ejected into the snow. She was already reloaded. The next one's closer, she said. Get off my property. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, something calculating the new information she had just provided about who she was and what she was willing to do. He turned his horse without a word. The hired men followed. She stood on the porch without her coat in the January cold and watched them ride out of the clearing and into the tree line and disappear. And she stood there for another full minute after they were gone, listening, making sure. Then her legs started shaking. She sat down on the porch step and put the rifle across her knees and breathed carefully until the shaking slowed, and she thought, Gideon needs to know tonight. She thought, Lucas heard that shot. She thought very briefly and very clearly, I'm so tired of this man. The cabin door opened behind her. Lucas. He stood in the doorway looking at the clearing, at the churned snow and the hoof prints and the ejected cartridge lying near the porch. They're gone, she said. I heard. He looked at her. Are you all right? She almost said fine. She stopped herself. Not entirely, she said, but I'm better than I was a minute ago. He sat down beside her on the step without being asked. They sat in the cold together for a moment, and it was an odd kind of comfortable. The shared silence of two people who have just come through something and are still taking inventory. You shot at them, he said, Near them. Still. He looked at the tree line where they'd gone. His voice had a particular quality. Not admiration exactly. Something more serious than that. I didn't know you could do that. I've been practicing. He nodded slowly. Then, don't tell Maisie you were scared. She looked at him. She doesn't need to know, he said. She'll worry. Evelyn looked at this 8-year-old boy who was trying, in his imperfect and slightly misguided way, to protect his sister the same way she was trying to protect all of them, and she put her arm around his shoulders briefly. All right, she said, I won't. Gideon came home after dark. She told him immediately and completely the way they'd developed between them. No softening, no editing for comfort. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, He won't come back himself, not now. He'll try something else. I know. We need to be ready for something else. I know that too. He looked at her across the fire. In the back room, the children were asleep, and the cabin was warm, and outside the wind was building toward something. You did right, he said. I know I did, she said. Not defensively, just as a fact. That was the night something shifted between them in a way that hadn't shifted before. It was small, and it wasn't romantic in any easy sense of the word. There were no declarations, no reaching across the table. It was more that Gideon looked at Evelyn and saw, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that she was not a woman he was protecting. She was a woman fighting beside him, and those were not the same thing, and the distinction mattered to him in a way that was new and that he didn't have language for yet. He started teaching her and Lucas both, seriously, systematically, over the following 2 weeks. Proper shooting, loading in cold hands, the layout of the property, and its defensible positions. Lucas absorbed everything with the focused intensity he brought to anything that Gideon taught him directly. Evelyn already knew more than he'd expected, which he acknowledged without making much of it, which she appreciated. They had 3 weeks of uneasy quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful so much as held, the quiet of a situation waiting for its next development. They went into town twice, always together now, always with purpose and return. They saw no sign of Voss. People in Black Hollow said he'd been spending time in Cheyenne. People in Black Hollow had a way of saying things that sounded like reassurance, but weren't. The barn burned on a Thursday night in February. No warning. No sounds that distinguished themselves from the ordinary sounds of a winter night until the sounds stopped being ordinary and became something else entirely. A deep, crackling roar that wasn't wind and wasn't anything natural. Evelyn woke first, which surprised her afterward. She'd expected Gideon's instincts to beat hers, but she woke with the smell of smoke in her lungs before she'd registered the sound, and she was on her feet saying his name before she was fully awake. Gideon hit the door at a run. The barn was fully involved by the time they got outside. Not the early creeping edge of a fire finding itself, but the full committed roar of one that had been burning for minutes before reaching a size they could see from the cabin. The horses. She thought it before she could stop herself, and it was already in Gideon's body before she thought it. He was already crossing the clearing at a run, and she ran after him because there was nothing else to do. The barn doors were hot to the touch. Gideon hit them open with his shoulder and the smoke poured out, and Evelyn pulled her shawl over her face and went in behind him because the horses were screaming, and the sound of it was the sound of an unbearable thing that had to be stopped. What came after was not heroic in any clean sense. It was hot and dark and disorienting, smoke so thick in places that up and down became negotiable. The horses wild with terror and nearly as dangerous as the fire. Gideon took burns along his left forearm, getting the bay gelding stall door open. Evelyn took a kick to her hip from the gray mare that she wouldn't feel properly until the next day. They got the horses out, both of them, into the snow and the cold and the clear air, coughing and wild-eyed and alive, and they got themselves out, and they stood in the clearing and watched the barn come down. It took 11 minutes to fall. The structure collapsed inward, the roof dropping first and then the walls leaning toward each other, and then the whole thing a pile of burning timber throwing sparks high into the February dark. The sound it made was the sound of something built with effort and intention being casually destroyed. Lucas was on the porch with Maisie pressed against his side, both of them watching. His face in the firelight was doing the thing Evelyn had seen it do before. That specific contained look of someone recording a wrong that they intend to remember. Maisie didn't say anything. She was looking at Evelyn with an expression of such concentrated worry that Evelyn crossed the clearing immediately to get to her. "I'm all right," Evelyn said, crouching down. "We're both all right." Maisie put both arms around her neck and didn't let go for a long time. Gideon stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the fire, and didn't speak. Evelyn could see the burn on his arm from across the yard, red and raw along the forearm, not deep enough to be critical, but deep enough to hurt considerably. He wasn't looking at it. He was looking at what was left of the barn. She went to him and looked at the burn and said, "We need to put something on that." "Later." "Now," she said. "Come inside." He came inside. She cleaned the burn and wrapped it, and he sat at the table and let her do it without protest, which told her something about the state he was in. He was not visibly angry in the way that expresses itself loudly. He was angry in the way that goes inward and stays there and gets very precise. "It was set," he said. He wasn't asking. "Yes," she said. "I didn't see anyone on the property." They were careful this time. He looked at the wrapped forearm. He looked at the wall. Then he said, very quietly, "I want to go into town tomorrow." "No," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "I'll go," she said. "You stay with the children." "Evelyn, you'll go into town and you'll find Voss and you'll do something that ends with you in a jail cell or worse, and then the children are alone," she said. "That's what he wants. He wants you reactive. He wants you to give him a reason." She held his eyes. "I'll go. I'll handle it." He was quiet for a long, resistant moment. She could feel the shape of what he wanted to do. It was not an unreasonable impulse, standing in the ruins of something that had taken him days to build. And she didn't pretend it was. She simply waited. "Fine," he said finally. The word cost him. "Thank you," she said. She rode into Black Hollow the next morning alone, and she went directly to the building on the north end of Main Street where Voss maintained his territorial office, and she walked in without knocking. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, and for the first time reading his face, she saw something she hadn't seen before. A small, careful adjustment. A man reassessing. She stood in front of his desk, and she did not sit down in the chair he didn't offer, and she did not raise her voice. "You burned our barn," she said. He said nothing. "You paid someone to burn it," she said. "I can't prove that in a courtroom today. But we both know it's true, and so does everyone else in this building who's listening through the walls right now, because people in this town are not as unobservant as you've been assuming." She put both hands flat on the edge of his desk. "I want you to hear me clearly, Mr. Voss. You have spent 4 months trying to take 2 orphaned children away from the only home they have left, and you have failed twice in court, and you have failed on my porch, and you failed last night. And I think you know that you're going to keep failing because you're fighting people who have nothing left to lose, and that makes them very difficult to discourage." She looked at him steadily. "If you touch my family again, my children, my husband, my property, I will spend every hour I have making sure that every business partner, every lender, every investor within 3 territories knows exactly who Calvin Voss is and how he operates. I will write letters. I will ride to Cheyenne myself if I have to. I am not a threat you can buy out or frighten off, and I think you've already worked that out." She straightened. "So I'm asking you, one time and plainly, is this finished?" The room was very quiet. Voss looked at her for a long moment with those flat winter water eyes. He was a man accustomed to reading situations, and she let him read this one. Then something happened in his face that was not quite a concession, but was the shape of a man who has completed a calculation and found that the numbers don't favor continuing. He said nothing. He looked back at his desk. Evelyn turned and walked out of his office and back into the cold February street, and she stood there for a moment in the hard winter light, breathing the clean air, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, exactly, but the specific solid feeling of having done the thing that needed doing. She rode home. It took 3 weeks, but the stories started spreading the way stories spread in territories where information travels on horseback, and through general store counters and over fences between neighboring ranches. Stories about Voss, his debts, his methods, the way he acquired land, the way he treated the people who owed him money. Some of them Evelyn had no part in.
Some of them Frank Dobbins started. Some of them came from people who'd been waiting for a reason and had found one in the burning of a family's barn in the middle of winter.
Investors began asking questions. Meetings didn't happen that had been scheduled to happen. One of the men whose paper Voss held came into Ruth Halsey's store and asked, in a roundabout way, whether there was a lawyer in the territory who handled debt restructuring. Calvin Voss listed his Black Hollow operations for sale in early March. He was gone by the end of the month, and nobody went out of their way to mark the occasion, and the spring came in behind him like a door closing on that particular chapter of their lives. The morning they heard he'd finally left, Gideon came in from the barn and said nothing about it, just sat down at the table and poured coffee. After a moment, Lucas said, "Is it over?" "Looks like," Gideon said. Lucas nodded. He picked up the piece of wood he'd been carving and went back to it. Maisie, who had been listening from the bench, looked at Evelyn. "Good," Maisie said, with the blunt finality of someone who has been patient long enough and is done with the subject. The burn on Gideon's arm healed into a scar. Another one for the collection, paler than the one on his jaw, shaped irregularly along the forearm. He didn't mention it. Evelyn noticed it sometimes when his sleeve was pushed up, the mark of the night they'd pulled horses out of a burning barn and stood in the snow and watched something they'd built fall down. They'd build it back. They already knew that. The ground was still frozen, but the light was changing, the quality of the afternoon different than it had been in January. Thinner, cleaner, carrying in it the suggestion of something that hadn't arrived yet but was coming. Spring in Wyoming was not a gentle thing, not a gradual, pleasant warming. It came in fits and was interrupted by cold, and was not reliable. But it came. They were still there to meet it. Spring arrived the way it always did in the Wyoming high country. Without apology and without much warning, one morning simply less brutal than the one before it. The light lasting a few minutes longer, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, and then retreating up the mountain inch by inch, like something conceding ground it had held all winter. It was not beautiful in any postcard sense. The melt turned the clearing into mud that grabbed at boots and sucked at hooves and made everything twice as difficult as it needed to be. The barn foundation was still a black scar in the earth. The horses, temporarily sheltered in a rough lean-to Gideon had constructed the week after the fire, were irritable and crowded and expressed their opinions loudly every morning. None of it felt like defeat. That was the thing Evelyn noticed first and kept noticing. After everything, the hearings, the fever, the hired men in the clearing, the fire, what remained was not a broken thing, but a stubborn one. And there is a significant difference between those two conditions, even when they look similar from the outside. Margaret Whitlock arrived in early April with a wagon. She'd written ahead, a letter that reached the cabin 2 weeks before she did, precise and practical in the way that her courtroom testimony had been precise and practical, which Evelyn was coming to understand was simply how Margaret communicated. The letter said she intended to visit for 2 weeks if that was acceptable. It said she had some matters to discuss regarding the children's inheritance from their father, which had been sitting in a St. Louis account since October, waiting for a legal guardian to claim it on their behalf. It said, at the very end, in handwriting that looked slightly different from the rest, as though she'd added it after setting the pen down and picking it up again, "I am not looking to interfere. I would simply like to know them, if they'll have me." Evelyn read that last line twice. Then she wrote back and said, "Come." Margaret arrived on a Tuesday with a hired wagon and a driver and more cargo than Evelyn had expected. Lumber. Good lumber, milled properly, in quantities that represented planning and forethought rather than impulse. Hardware. A crate of tools that made Gideon go quiet in the way he went quiet when something mattered to him and he wasn't ready to say so. "For the barn," Margaret said, standing in the muddy clearing in her traveling coat, looking at the burned foundation with the direct gaze of someone who has seen hard things and doesn't flinch from them. "It needs to be rebuilt. I thought it was better to bring the materials than to write a number in a letter." She looked at Gideon. "I'm not trying to buy my way into anything. Robert would have done the same thing, and you know it." Gideon held her eyes for a moment. Whatever passed through him, he kept it brief. "Thank you," he said. He said it the way he said things that mattered, once, directly, without decoration. Lucas had come out of the cabin and was standing at the edge of the porch, watching. He'd been cautious about Margaret since the courtroom. Not unfriendly, not hostile, but watchful in the way he was watchful about anything new, taking careful inventory before he committed to a position. Margaret didn't push at him. She looked at him across the clearing and said, "You look even more like your father in daylight," and then turned back to supervising the unloading of the wagon as though she hadn't said anything particularly significant. Lucas stood on the porch for a long moment. Then he came down the steps and walked over to the wagon and started helping unload lumber without being asked. Maisie had no such complicated feelings about Margaret. Maisie had decided in the courtroom that this was a person worth trusting, and Maisie's instincts, Evelyn had learned over the months, were considerably more reliable than they had any right to be in a 5-year-old. By the end of Margaret's first day at the cabin, Maisie had shown her every significant item in her possession. Clara, a collection of pine cones she'd been curating for reasons she hadn't explained, a river stone with a white stripe through it that she'd found in the spring melt. And Margaret had examined each one with the seriousness they deserved and had not smiled indulgently or rushed her, which Maisie noticed and filed away. The 2 weeks Margaret stayed were not uncomplicated. She and Gideon were careful around each other at first. Two people who had both loved the same man in different ways and were still working out what that meant in terms of what they owed each other. Margaret had known Robert Alderton since he was a boy. Gideon had known him as a man, the stripped-down version of a person that the wilderness shows you when the social layers fall away. They had different pieces of the same person, and neither piece was complete without the other, and they both understood this without it becoming a comfortable thing overnight. But they worked on this barn together. That helped. There is something about physical labor alongside another person, the negotiation of it, the way you learn someone's pace and competence and patience through the simple mechanics of building something, that shortens the distance between people faster than conversation usually does. By the end of the first week, Gideon was talking to Margaret in the direct, efficient way he talked to people he'd decided were worth talking to. By the end of the second week, they'd had one genuine argument about the placement of a support beam and resolved it without either of them conceding entirely, which was the kind of resolution that Gideon, in particular, seemed to find more comfortable than an easy peace. The legal matter Margaret had mentioned in her letter turned out to be substantial. Robert Alderton had been a careful man, more careful than anyone had given him credit for. He'd maintained a small account in St. Louis through the years of mountain living, adding to it slowly, the proceeds from years of timber sales and trapping and the careful, quiet accumulation of a man who thought about his children's future without ever saying much about it. It wasn't a fortune, but it was real money, more than Evelyn had seen at any point in her adult life. And Margaret had the paperwork necessary to transfer it to Gideon and Evelyn's guardianship for the children's benefit. She spread the documents on the cabin table the night before she left, and she went through them with Gideon and Evelyn carefully. And she answered their questions. And when everything was signed, she put the copies in her bag and sat back and looked at the two of them across the table. "Robert chose well," she said. She wasn't talking about the money. Evelyn looked at the fire. Her throat tightened the way it did sometimes when things were too directly true to absorb straight on. Gideon said, "He was a good man." "He was," Margaret said. "Infuriating, but good." She said it with a small, private smile that suggested long acquaintance with both qualities. Then she looked at Lucas and Maisie, who were on the bench, Maisie half asleep against her brother's shoulder. "They're going to be fine," she said. "You know that." "I know they're going to try hard," Evelyn said. "That's not always the same thing." "No," Margaret agreed, "but it's the better half of it." She left the next morning. She hugged Maisie and shook Lucas's hand. He offered it first, which surprised everyone, including him. And she told them she would write, and she would visit, and she meant both. She looked at Gideon one last time before she mounted the wagon, and she said, "He was right about you." And Gideon nodded and didn't say anything, which was the right response. Evelyn watched the wagon until it disappeared into the trees, and then she stood in the clearing for a moment with the spring air moving around her and the sound of Gideon and Lucas already back at the barn work, the rhythm of hammering steady and purposeful against the mountain quiet. She thought about Robert Alderton, a man she'd never met, who had trusted a scarred mountain trapper with his children's future. She thought about the particular kind of faith that requires, not blind faith, but the evidence-based faith of someone who had watched another person over years and understood their character more clearly than that person perhaps understood it themselves. She thought about what it meant that all of this, the saloon, the midnight ceremony, The courtroom, the fever, the burning barn, the whole complicated year of it had begun with a dead man's trust in someone everyone else had written off. Things connect in ways you don't see while they're connecting. That was what she took from it, standing in the mud and the April light. The choices that matter most are usually the ones that don't look like choices at the time. The moment in the saloon when she stood up from her corner, the moment Gideon told Lucas the truth about the court summons instead of softening it, the moment Margaret Whitlock added that last line to her letter in different handwriting. Small moments that turned out to be load-bearing walls. She went back inside and made coffee and got on with the day. The barn went up through April and into May, Gideon and Lucas doing most of the work themselves with Margaret's lumber, and 2 days of help from Frank Dobbins, who arrived unannounced one Saturday with his own tools and stayed for the better part of a weekend and talked more in those 2 days than he apparently had in the previous several months combined. The new structure was larger than the old one, slightly, not dramatically, but enough to notice. Gideon had drawn the plans himself, simple and precise on a piece of paper that he'd measured twice before he drew anything. Lucas had opinions about the plans. He was 9 now. He'd had a birthday in March that they'd celebrated with the specific, awkward earnestness of people still learning how to celebrate things together. Maisie having insisted on some form of cake, and Gideon having produced something that was technically a cake in the same way that a snow house is technically architecture. Lucas had blown out the candles with the expression of someone trying not to show that it mattered to him. He was different at 9 than he'd been at 8, though the difference was incremental and hard to name precisely. He was still watchful, still carried that ingrained habit of alertness that wasn't going anywhere for a long time, but he laughed more openly than he had. He argued with Gideon about barn construction specifics for 3 days running before Gideon finally said, "Fine, draw what you think." And Lucas drew it, and the drawing was, as Gideon looked at it for a long moment before admitting, not wrong about the window placement. Gideon didn't say you were right. He said, "That'll work," and modified the plan, and Lucas watched him do it with an expression he quickly directed toward the ground. But he stood a little straighter after that. Maisie at 6 was something else entirely. She was sharp in the way that quiet children sometimes are. Having spent so much of her early years listening while others talked, she had developed an ear for subtext that made adults around her occasionally uneasy. She asked questions that landed in the center of things. She asked Gideon once, out of nowhere at supper, "Were you lonely before we came?" And the table went very still, and Gideon sat with the question for a moment and then said, "Yes," because he was incapable of lying to her, and they both seemed to know it. "Me too," she said. "Even when my mom and dad were there sometimes." She thought about it. "Is that bad?" "No," Gideon said. "That's just how it is sometimes." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her supper. Evelyn looked at the fire. Gideon looked at his plate. Later, when the children were asleep, he said to Evelyn, "Did she mean what I think she meant?" "Yes," Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. "She's something." "She is," Evelyn agreed. He picked up his coffee. "All of us were lonely," he said. It was not self-pity. It was the straightforward observation of a man who has thought something through and is stating his conclusion. That's probably not a coincidence, that we all found each other. Evelyn looked at him. He didn't say things like that often. Reflective things, connective things, the kind of observation that required sitting still with your own interior life long enough to notice what was in it. She was aware that he was getting better at it, slowly, the way a man who has been alone too long slowly relearns the language of being in relation to other people. It wasn't graceful. He still went to the barn when he needed to be alone, still communicated preference in monosyllables when he was tired, still had a temper that ran cold rather than hot, and was not, for that reason, always easy to read. He was not a transformed man. He was the same man with a few more rooms opened up. "No," she said, "probably not a coincidence." She thought about Thomas, her husband. She thought about Samuel. She did this less often than she used to. Not because they mattered less, but because grief changes shape over time in ways that people who haven't lived through it don't quite believe. It doesn't disappear. It becomes something you carry differently, more practiced at the weight, less surprised by it when it shifts. She had loved Thomas, and she had loved Samuel, and she would not stop loving them because she was here on a mountain in Wyoming with a scarred trapper and 2 children who were not hers by blood, and were entirely hers in every way that counted. The heart is not a fixed-size container. That was the thing she'd learned this year, the thing she would not have told you she needed to learn before she learned it. It doesn't get used up. Summer came and the property changed with it. The new barn stood solid against the tree line, the fresh lumber still pale and clean-smelling. The garden Evelyn had put in with Lucas's reluctant help and Maisie's enthusiastic interference came up in untidy, productive rows. The vegetables not particularly well organized, but present, which was the point. Gideon broke additional ground for a second garden plot that would bear next year, working it in the evenings with the patient, systematic effort he brought to everything physical. The ranch, which had been the word Gideon had used loosely for years without it meaning much, began to actually become one. 2 additional horses, chickens that Maisie named individually and Gideon pretended to find absurd and was observed on 2 separate occasions talking to. A structure that was developing slowly from a trapper's survival outpost into something that looked like a place people intended to stay. Word traveled in the territory the way it always did, which was in every direction and faster than you expected. The Crow family on the ridge north of Black Hollow, the mountain man who'd married the widow to keep the orphan children, the woman who'd fired a rifle in her own yard and walked into Calvin Voss's office alone and ended it. The story had texture to it, the kind of texture that sticks in people's memory because it's not a simple story, not a clear hero and villain playing their expected roles, but something more complicated and therefore more true. The first family arrived in the fall. They came the way lost things usually arrive, without announcement, without particular planning, through the kind of accidental word of mouth that happens when desperate people talk to other desperate people in frontier territories. A woman named Clara Prentice, Maisie had been delighted by the name, taking it as a personal sign, came up the mountain trail with 2 small boys, a broken wagon wheel, and the flat, exhausted look of someone who has been making decisions at the edge of their capacity for too long. Her husband had died in a mining accident in August. She had no family in the territory and very little left of anything else. She wasn't asking to stay. She said that clearly, early, as though she was afraid of being presumptuous. She'd been told the Crows might know of work, or somewhere to go, or someone who could help with the wheel. Evelyn looked at the 2 small boys standing in the clearing, looking at the cabin with the particular blank attention of children who've been through something hard and are waiting to find out what comes next. She looked at Gideon. He was already looking at her. "Stay for supper," he said to Clara Prentice. "We'll figure out the wheel in the morning." Clara Prentice stayed for 3 weeks, which turned into a winter, which turned into something more permanent that none of them formally decided on. She worked hard and did not complain, and had a practical competence with animals that made Gideon revise his initial assessment of her quickly upward. Her boys, ages 4 and 6, integrated into the cabin's population with the adaptability of young children who have learned to find safety where it presents itself. The cabin was very full. Too full some days, in the specific way that too many people in a small space generates a particular kind of friction that requires patience no one has in unlimited supply. Gideon added a room in the spring, then another the following year. The structure grew the way living things grows at, not according to a plan exactly, but according to need. The Prentice family was the first. They were not the last. Not all of them stayed the way Clara did. Some came through and moved on, better supplied, better oriented, equipped for the next leg of whatever road they were on. A teenage boy named Ellis, who'd been sleeping rough in Black Hollow for 3 weeks, and who turned out to be exceptionally good with horses, and who stayed for 2 years before heading to Cheyenne with a recommendation from Gideon and enough saved money to start something of his own. A widow with a daughter who needed a winter and left in the spring. Others who came and went and carried something of the mountain with them when they left. Some practical thing, a skill or a tool or a direction, or sometimes just the knowledge that there was a place that would not turn you away at the door in the dark. Lucas understood what was happening before anyone named it. He was 11 when Ellis arrived, and he watched Gideon with the Ellis situation with the particular attention of someone recognizing something. "You do this because of us," he said to Gideon one evening. They were at the workbench in the barn, the habitual position by now. Lucas with his own piece of wood and his own knife, Gideon beside him. Gideon looked at what he was carving. "What do you mean? You started it because of us, helping people who had nowhere." Lucas turned the wood in his hands. "And then you just kept doing it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Maybe, he said. It's a good thing, Lucas said. Not as a compliment, as an assessment. Sometimes, Gideon said, sometimes it's just hard. Lucas nodded. He understood that. At 11, having been the recipient of the hard version of it himself, he understood exactly what Gideon meant. That the doing of a good thing doesn't make the doing of it easy, and that the value of a thing isn't diminished by the cost of it, and that people who make it look effortless are either not doing it honestly or not talking about what it takes. There is no version of this, of building something real with broken materials, of staying when staying is hard, of choosing other people's children as your own, that doesn't cost you something real. He also understood, having lived inside the result of it, that the cost was worth paying. He kept that conclusion to himself. He was 12 before he said anything adjacent to it out loud, and even then it was sideways, delivered to Evelyn rather than Gideon, because some things are easier to say to the person you said your first real words to in this family. I know why you said yes, he told her. They were on the porch, early morning, the particular quiet hour before the cabin filled with the sounds of other people starting their days. In the saloon. I figured it out. Evelyn looked at him. He was 12 and tall for it, and the anger that had lived on the surface of him for so long had moved inward, become something more like intensity, which was a different and more useful thing. Tell me, she said, because you'd lost someone, and you recognized that we had. He didn't look at her directly. He was looking at the mountains. And you thought maybe it would help. Both ways. She was quiet for a moment. The morning was clear and cold and very beautiful in the way that Wyoming mornings in early fall are. The peaks showing their first dusting of new snow, the light coming in sideways in gold across the clearing. That's most of it, she said. What's the rest? She thought about how to say the true thing without it sounding like something she'd rehearsed. I'd been invisible for 4 years, she said. To the town. To myself, most days. And then She paused. And then Gideon stood up in that room and said something that made everybody go quiet. And I thought that was a moment, that if I let it pass, I'd be invisible for another 4 years. She looked at the mountains. I was so tired of being invisible. Lucas was quiet for a while. Then, you're not invisible now. No, she said. I'm not. He nodded once. She recognized the nod. It was Gideon's nod, the small, precise acknowledgement that closes something without ceremony. He'd picked it up somewhere along the 2 years, and it had become his own. He went inside to start the morning fire. She stayed on the porch a few more minutes, listening to the waking sounds of the cabin. Maisie's voice, already clear and carrying from the back room, the sounds of the Prentice boys arguing over something minor, Gideon's footsteps crossing the main room, heavy and deliberate. The mountains stood over all of it, indifferent and permanent and enormous, the way they always had and would continue to long after every one of them was gone. They did not care about the Crow family on the ridge north of Black Hollow. They had watched 100,000 desperate small dramas play out on their slopes, and they would watch 100,000 more. The mountains kept their own counsel, but the people were here now. That mattered too. The fire Evelyn had told herself she was too careful to want had been burning since November of 1874. It burned through fear and legal proceedings and a child's fever and a barn gone to ash and a man who wanted to take everything. It burned through the slow work of learning to love people you did not choose and then realizing at some point that you had, in fact, chosen them. That every morning you got up and made the coffee and fed the fire and met the day alongside them was a choice, and you kept making it, and that's what choosing actually looks like when it's real rather than theoretical. Every winter night, after the cabin had settled into its various sleeps, Gideon would add the last log of the day to the fire and bank it for the night. It was his task, had been his task since before any of them arrived, and he had not relinquished it and no one had asked him to. Evelyn would sit up a few minutes longer, the habit of her, and the two of them would have the particular quiet that belongs to people who have said everything urgent and now have the luxury of silence. One of those evenings, late in their second winter together, he said something. He'd been looking at the fire for a while, and she'd been reading, and she looked up when he spoke. "Do you miss it?" he said. "Town, the way things were." She thought about the small room above the laundry, the particular silence of an empty second chair, the 4 years of invisibility. "No," she said. He nodded. Do you miss it? She said. Before all of us. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, I miss the quiet sometimes, he said. Not the alone part. The quiet. I can be quieter. You're fine. He said it gruffly, which was how he said things he meant. You're fine, Evelyn. She looked at him for a moment. This man with the silver scar on his jaw and the burn mark on his forearm, and the hands that could field dress an elk or hold a child without making it look strange. This man who had walked into a saloon in the dead of winter and asked an impossible thing and had somehow, in the asking of it, started something that none of them had intended and all of them had needed. Were you kind today? She said. It had started as something she said to herself, a question she'd developed in the lonely years as a daily accounting, a small private measure when the days were long and without obvious purpose. She'd said it aloud once without meaning to, and Gideon had heard it and given her a look that was somewhere between puzzled and interested. And she'd explained it, and he hadn't said anything. But after that, he'd started listening for it at the end of the day. She could tell. And then one night she'd asked it directly and discovered his answer. He looked at the fire. He thought about it the way he thought about everything. Without rushing, without performance. I tried, he said. She nodded. She picked up her book. Outside, the Wyoming winter pressed against the cabin walls with all its old familiar weight, the wind running down from the high peaks the way it had done for centuries and would do for centuries more. Inside, the fire held, the cabin held, the family, imperfect and complicated and nothing like what any of them had imagined wanting, back in whatever version of before they each carried, held too. It had not been a clean story. It had not resolved itself neatly or arrived at a state of permanent, uncomplicated happiness. They were still the people they had always been, carrying the same fractures and losses and difficult habits. Lucas would always be watchful. Maisie would always see through everything. Gideon would always need the barn. Evelyn would always feel the absence of the people she'd lost, would always carry it alongside everything else, because that is how grief and love coexist. Not in sequence, but simultaneously. The loss and the living, both of them real at the same time. But they were here. That was the thing. They had all been people that circumstance had left at the edge of something, looking in. Lucas and Maisie with their terrible loss, Evelyn with her 4 years of disappearing, Gideon with his decade of choosing solitude because connection had seemed more dangerous than the alternative. And then one cold night, a desperate man had walked into a room and made an impossible ask, and a woman had stood up from her corner, and everything had changed its direction. Not because of fate, not because of anything grand or inevitable, because of a choice, and then another choice after that, and then another, the long, unglamorous work of choosing each other every ordinary day, in the cold and the mud and the friction, and the occasional grace of evenings when everything was quiet, and the fire was warm, and the mountain stood over everything, indifferent and enormous. And inside the cabin on the ridge the family held. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that ever is.